streets of Rome never truly slept. By day, the marble temples gleamed in the sun, but by night, torchlight flickered across narrow alleys, and behind the grandeur of empire, another world stirred to life. A world of survival, shadows, and women whose stories history rarely tells. The prostitutes of ancient Rome. Welcome to The Boring Historian. If you enjoy these calming journeys, make sure to subscribe. And let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now take a breath, get comfortable, and let's begin. The Subura was not a place where Rome's senators lingered. It was a district many of the wealthy avoided, a maze of alleys wedged between the Esquiline, and Viminal hills pressed so tightly together that the sun seemed to struggle to reach its bottom floors. The tenements here rose dangerously high, wooden balconies leaning outward as if ready to collapse, and the streets below were alive with noise, filth, and an energy that never seemed to rest. At dawn, the Subura was already awake. The voices of traders filled the air as carts rattled over cobbled stones, selling bread that was half flour, half chaff, and jars of wine cut with water. Smoke drifted from makeshift braziers where the poor warmed themselves before the day's labor. Chickens scattered at the feet of children, and dogs gnawed at scraps tossed from upper windows. The smells mixed into a sharp and dizzying cocktail. The sour reek of wine shops, the heavy musk of sweat, and the tang of fish left too long in the sun. Among the thousands who lived here, in the very heart of Rome's poverty, were the prostitutes, women whose survival depended on being visible, yet invisible at the same time. Their world was not the grand colonnades of the Forum, nor the polished villas of senators, but the Subaru's taverns, brothels, and shadowed doorways. Let us follow one of them now. Her name was Lucilia. She lived in a cramped room high in an insula, one of the towering apartment blocks that leaned dangerously close to collapse. The walls were cracked, and when the wind blew, dust drifted down from the ceiling like a warning. She shared her room with another woman, Marcia, a friend and sometimes rival, both bound together by necessity. The space was barely wide enough for 2 pallets, a clay oil lamp, and a small chest where they kept their few belongings. A comb, a mirror of polished bronze, and scraps of cloth to serve as makeshift cosmetics. When the first light of morning crept through the warped shutters, Lucilia stirred. The city was loud before she even opened her eyes. From the street below came the cries of sellers. Fresh bread, olives, figs, mixed with the distant hammering of blacksmiths already at work. Somewhere a woman shouted after a child. The city never offered silence. She rose slowly, pulling her tunic over her shoulders, the fabric worn thin from years of use. Her hair was dark and tangled, and she reached for a small pot of powder and a cheap mixture of chalk and crushed herbs to give her cheeks some color. Prostitutes were expected to make themselves noticeable, but in the Subura, there was little glamour to it. The powders clung unevenly, the cheap dyes stained their fingers, and the perfumes, when they could afford them, smelled sharp rather than sweet. She and Marcia descended the narrow staircase of their insula, careful not to trip over the broken steps. The street was already teeming. They made their way to a public fountain, one of the many that lined Rome's neighborhoods, fed by the city's great aqueducts. Here, women gathered to fill jars, to wash their faces, to exchange gossip. Lucilia dipped her hands into the cool water, splashing her skin, trying to wipe away the heavy air of the tenement. Marcia laughed softly beside her, making some jest about a baker's boy who passed them a smile. Even in such lives, moments of levity slipped through. But survival pressed in quickly. For these women, every day required calculation. A prostitute in Rome needed to draw the eye without drawing too much attention. Too bold, and she risked harassment by the watch or anger from local matrons. Too discreet, and she would go hungry. The Subura was alive with possibilities. Taverns lined the streets, their doorways dark even in daylight, filled with men drinking cheap wine before heading to the baths or the fields. Brothels were tucked between bakeries and shops, marked by crude paintings or a red lantern above the door. And there were the streets themselves, where women leaned against doorways or walked slowly, catching the gaze of passers-by. Lucilia and Marcia often began their day not by seeking customers directly, but by moving through the district, visiting a tavern keeper they knew, exchanging a smile with the man who sold garlands of flowers, listening for whispers of who might be in need of company. In a place like the Subura, word of mouth meant survival. Yet the dangers were constant. Soldiers passed through on their way to the barracks. Some were generous, others violent. Merchants bargained not only for goods, but for women, expecting them to lower their prices to a single coin. There was no protection, no law that truly shielded them. The authorities saw them as infames, dishonorable without voice or rights. If they were cheated, beaten, or worse, few would listen. Still they endured. As the sun rose higher, Lucilia adjusted the clasp on her tunic and prepared herself for the day. The city would soon grow hotter, noisier, more demanding. She glanced at Marcia, whose laughter already rang out as she teased a passing fruit seller. Together, they stepped further into the swarm of Rome's busiest district. Two among thousands, but bound to the streets in a way marble and history would never record. This was the Subura. A place of constant hunger, constant noise, and constant survival. And for Rome's prostitutes, it was home. The sun climbed slowly above Rome's rooftops, spilling light into the narrow alleys of the Subura. Shadows retreated into doorways, but the streets were still cloaked in the grime and dampness of the night before. For Lucilia and Marcia, this was the hour of decision. When the city stirred, and they had to transform themselves into what survival demanded, neither woman owned much. The little chest in their insula contained not silks or perfumes, but scraps of cloth, pots of chalk, bits of jewelry that had passed through too many hands to be new. Each piece carried a story of barter, a ring traded for a week's meals, a necklace borrowed from another woman in exchange for a promise. Their lives were stitched together from such exchanges, where every object was both necessity and burden. Lucilia sat on the edge of the pallet, holding up the bronze mirror, its surface warped and scratched. Her face peered back at her, familiar and weary. She dipped her fingers into a small dish of sarusa, a paste of chalk and vinegar. Spread across her cheeks, it gave her skin a pale glow that caught the light, though she knew it burned faintly and sometimes left sores. Still, it was what customers expected. A face made to seem younger, smoother, more alluring. Beside her, Marcia combed her hair, the dark strands stiff with yesterday's oil. She laughed as she tipped her head to Lucilia. "If you paint too much, you'll look like a senator's wife." It was a cruel joke, and yet not untrue. Respectable Roman women were supposed to appear modest, untouched by cosmetics, yet in private they too stained their lips and cheeks. The difference was that a matron's powders were hidden behind shutters, while Marcia and Lucilia wore theirs openly, as a sign of their trade. Jewelry came next. Marcia fastened bronze bangles to her wrists, the metal dulled by time, and pinned a cheap brooch at her shoulder. Lucilia slipped on earrings of colored glass, bright but fragile. For a moment, as the sunlight struck them, they looked almost like emeralds. In this, there was a kind of illusion, a fleeting sense that they were adorned like the courtesans of poets' verses. But the illusion never lasted. Their tunics were simple, dyed in colors that had long faded, patched where the fabric had torn. Some women dyed their hair blonde with saffron or ashes, mimicking the Germans who were prized for their looks, but Lucilia's hair remained dark. The dye was costly, and besides, she knew it ruined the scalp. When they had prepared themselves as best they could, the women left the insula once more, carrying the weight of their transformation into the daylight. Already, the Subura was louder. Bakers' shops selling bread blackened from uneven ovens. Taverns opening their doors to customers, still drunk from the night before. Somewhere a lyre was strumming, its sound clashing with the call of a peddler selling figs. Before the work of the day began, Lucilia and Marcia often stopped at a small shrine tucked between two buildings. It was nothing grand, just a niche in the wall with a worn statue of Venus, draped in faded garlands. Women like them came here quietly, leaving tiny offerings. A coin, a sprig of rosemary, a whisper of prayer. They asked for protection from violence, for favor in their dealings, for the strength to endure another day. Venus was a goddess of love and beauty, but here in the Subura, she was also a goddess of survival. Lucilia pressed her hand to the cold stone, murmuring a few words under her breath. She did not ask for riches, nor freedom. Such things seemed too far away, I asked. Only to be spared from cruelty that day, to be treated like a human being, even if only briefly. Marcia left a dried flower she had tucked into her sash, smiling faintly as if mocking the ritual. Yet even she bowed her head before they left. The day was not without fear. The women knew the risks well. Rome's laws marked prostitutes as infames, dishonored, stripped of protection. The city's guards might take their coin as bribes or seize them for amusement. At times, moral reformers demanded raids, dragging women from brothels into the streets as warnings to others. Even in the Subura, there was danger not only from clients but from the very authorities who claimed to govern the city. And yet, there was no choice. Work was survival. If they did not step into the taverns, if they did not lean in doorways with painted faces, hunger would claim them faster than violence ever could. As they walked, there was no sisterhood here, not truly. Competition was fierce, each woman vying for the eyes and coins of men who could be cruelly selective. Yet in passing, there were nods, small acknowledgments of shared fate. By mid-morning, the Subura was thick with life. Men came and went from taverns, workers paused for a drink before returning to labor, and the day's business began in earnest. Lucilia and Marcia lingered near a wine shop where soldiers often gathered. They spoke softly to each other, watching, waiting. This was the rhythm of their lives, a performance that began anew each day, painted faces and borrowed finery, masking the exhaustion that sat deep in their bones. And so, as Rome's streets thundered with footsteps, as carts rolled by and voices rose in argument, the prostitutes of the Subura prepared themselves to step once more into the unrelenting cycle of survival, painted, adorned, and armed with nothing but their bodies and their resilience. They became part of the city's pulse, unseen in history's marble, but essential to the life of the eternal city. By late morning, the Subura's air grew heavier. Heat clung to the alleys, carrying with it the smells of roasting meat, unwashed bodies, the sour stench of wine spilled in gutters. For Lucilia and Marcia, the streets offered a beginning, a place to catch the wandering eye, but the true center of their world lay behind a painted doorway. The lupanar, the brothel. It stood tucked between a bakery and a workshop, its entrance marked by a crude image scratched into plaster, a woman reclining. Arms raised, a sign to any passerby who might wonder what business was done inside. The doorway was narrow, the wood dark with age, and above it hung a small lantern of red glass. By day, it looked unimpressive, even shabby, but at night the glow cast into the street left no doubt about what lay within. The interior was close and dim, lit by oil lamps, whose smoke stained the ceiling.
Ow.
The air was heavy with incense, meant to disguise the less pleasant odors, though it mingled instead into a perfume of sweat, cheap oils, and damp stone. Voices carried through the small rooms, laughter, bargaining, the occasional cry. The walls were painted with frescoes, faded by years of smoke, scenes of lovers entwined, of women and men in poses meant to entice, a gallery of desire reduced to decoration. The lupanar was run by a keeper, a leno, whose word inside was law. He was not a man of refinement, but of necessity, calculating, watchful, always ensuring that coins were collected and order was maintained. For prostitutes like Lucilia and Marcia, there was little choice but to submit to his rules. A portion of every transaction belonged to him, and any disobedience risked not only expulsion but violence. The rooms themselves were small and bare. Each cell had a narrow stone bed, sometimes with a straw mattress, often with nothing but a blanket. The walls bore names scratched by previous women, a testament to lives that had passed through, forgotten except for letters etched into plaster. There was no privacy, no softness. Business was meant to be quick, efficient, unremarkable. Customers flowed steadily. Soldiers came first, clattering in armor, smelling of leather and iron, their laughter coarse and loud. Some were generous, tossing an extra coin for wine. Others were rough, demanding more than agreed. Slaves followed, slipping in with furtive glances, their coins clutched tightly, eager for moments of power denied to them elsewhere. Merchants came too, their robes finer, their speech calculated, seeking not passion, but distraction, before returning to their shops. Lucilia learned to read them at a glance. the soldier who joked loudly but carried sadness in his eyes, the merchant who haggled over every coin yet left a little extra for oil, the slave who shook as if terrified of being caught, his need greater than his courage. Each man brought his own burdens into the brothel, and the women learned to shoulder them in silence. Marcia was quicker with her laughter, sharper with her words. She knew how to flatter, how to turn a man's boast into a moment of pride. Lucilia was quieter, her strength lying in listening. Some men wanted only to be heard, to spill their troubles into the darkness where no judgment followed. Between them, the women carved out what little advantage they could, surviving transaction by transaction. The brothel keeper ensured the order of things. He collected payment before entry, watched for fights, kept a ledger of who worked which room. To him, the women were names and numbers, replaceable, valuable, only so long as they brought in coin. Yet he also knew their worth to his livelihood, and so he maintained a fragile balance, strict enough to prevent chaos, lenient enough to keep them returning. Time passed strangely inside the lupaner. The dim lamps in windowless rooms made morning indistinguishable from night. The flow of customers determined the rhythm. A surge at midday when men slipped away from labor. A lull in the afternoon heat. Another rush when the taverns emptied and wine loosened inhibitions. Between clients, Lucilia sometimes sat in the small courtyard at the brothel center. A cracked cistern held water for washing, though it was never clean for long. She would dip her hands, cool her face, breathe for a moment of quiet. Around her, other women did the same. Some adjusting their clothing, some reapplying powder, others simply staring into the middle distance, conserving strength. There was no conversation then, only silence, as if each woman were gathering herself for the next round. Yet even in such places, small fragments of humanity appeared. Once, a fellow prostitute offered Lucilia a piece of honey cake, saved from a client too drunk to eat it. Another time, Marcia sang softly as she braided her hair, a tune from childhood that lingered in the humid air. Such moments did not erase the harshness of their reality, but they made it bearable. As the day wore on, the lupanar's walls absorbed more voices, more footsteps, more weariness. Coins clinked into the keeper's box, oil lamps burned lower, and still the work continued. The women of the brothel, painted and adorned with what little they had, endured. Their bodies were currency, their time rented in slivers, yet through it all, they remained unbroken. Shadows in Rome's great machine, unrecorded in marble, but present in the heartbeat of the city. And so, as Lucilia left one of the narrow rooms and stepped back into the smoky hallway, she adjusted her tunic, steadied her breath, and prepared herself once again. There was no ending here, only continuation. The lupiner did not rest, and neither could she. The hours of the day moved slowly inside the lupana. The flicker of oil lamps casts uneven light across the painted walls, illuminating scenes of passion meant to entice, but often serving as a cruel reminder of the work at hand. For the women, each new client is an unknown, a test of endurance, of patience, and of survival. Claudia, whose laughter had once been genuine before hardship turned it into a mask, sits upon a simple couch of straw-stuffed cushions. The curtain pulls back, and her first patron of the afternoon enters. He is a soldier, armor still dusty from patrol. His eyes betray both fatigue and hunger, not for food but for escape. He speaks little, and when he does, it is with clipped words. For him, this visit is a transaction, a brief moment to forget the discipline of the camp and the constant threat of death. Claudia does not resist. She knows this type well. Rough, quick, and gone as soon as the coin clinks into the brothel keeper's hand. She endures the encounter, then washes herself with perfumed oil to mask the lingering presence. Nearby, Aaliyah greets a man of wealth, a merchant draped in dyed wool, his rings glinting in the lamplight. He carries himself with the assurance of one accustomed to power. His demands are not hurried, but precise, rehearsed, as though he believes his wealth entitles him to something greater than others. He speaks to her of his ventures, of ships bound for Alexandria, of spices, and silks arriving from the east, as if she were a confidant rather than a woman hired for the night. Aaliyah listens, nodding, feigning interest, because she knows silence might be mistaken for disrespect. She pours him watered wine, and when he grows sentimental, she leans closer. allowing him to believe for an hour that she is more than an illusion. Not every client is cruel, nor every visit hollow. Occasionally a man arrives whose heart is burdened more than his body. A freedman named Gaius, who works in the workshops along the Tiber, comes not for lust, but for company. He pays his coin dutifully, sits upon the low stool, and speaks of his loneliness. His wife died years ago. His children live far away, and in Claudia's presence he finds a listening ear. She lets him speak, her gaze softening, though inside she wonders why kindness must be bought in such a place. When he departs, he thanks her sincerely. An odd gesture in a world where gratitude is rare. But the darker encounters linger longest. Some men arrive already drunk, their tempers sharpened by wine. Their hands are rough, their expectations violent. The women have little choice but to endure. The brothel keeper intervenes only if damage threatens the business. Their safety is secondary to profit. Bruises are hidden beneath robes, and tears are swallowed before the next patron enters. Each woman learns quickly that survival depends on performance, the ability to smile when her heart aches, to speak gently when fear coils in her chest. As the day wears on, the contrast between clients becomes starker. Soldiers leave coins begrudgingly, their needs urgent and physical. Merchants linger, demanding attentiveness, as though they rented not just a body, but affection. Freedmen and slaves scrape together what they can, arriving with desperation, seeking in the dim light a taste of what life denies them elsewhere. And through it all, the women remain, their lives measured in encounters, their identities reshaped by the endless stream of strangers. The lupanar does not judge. It is a place of masks. Masks worn by the clients, masks worn by the women. Behind the painted walls and perfumed oils, beneath the weight of laughter, both forced and fleeting, there lies the unspoken truth. This is not love, nor romance, but survival. Each touch, each whispered word, each carefully concealed sigh is part of the act, an endless performance played for coin and nothing more. By nightfall, exhaustion sets in. The women steal brief moments between visits, moments to breathe, to rest against the cool stone wall, to gather their strength. Outside, the streets of Rome continue with their noise and bustle, but within the lupanar time moves in circles, repeating itself with each new patron, and still, the night is far from over. Not all prostitution in Rome was confined to the lupanar's painted walls or the dim, lantern-lit rooms of Subura-esque brothels. For many women, especially those too poor or too independent to pay a brothel keeper, their place of survival was the city itself. The streets of Rome were their workplace, and as the sun sank low, casting a coppery haze across the tiled rooftops, the women stepped out from their cramped insulae into alleys already humming with life. Imagine it now. The echo of sandals on stone pavements worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The cries of street vendors still hawking their wares long after midday, the rising smell of grilled fish and spiced sausages from smoky tavern doors. The air was thick, a mix of roasting meat, horse manure, spilled wine, and the damp mildew of buildings stacked too close together. Rome was alive with sound, 1,000 voices overlapping, dogs barking, wheels of carts creaking over cobbles. It was in this restless, pulsing environment that the women of the streets sought their clients. They did not carry themselves like the painted courtesans of myth. Instead, they wrapped themselves in worn tunics. Some dyed with cheap saffron to signal their trade, and others showing their bodies openly with hems hiked higher than a matron would ever dare. A scarf dyed red or yellow, a touch of powder on the cheeks, hair curled with ash. These were their tools, just as much as the faded sandals on their feet. Their faces were tired and their eyes watched constantly, measuring every passerby. Would this man sneer? Would he throw an insult? Would he reach for his purse? Some women lingered outside taverns, leaning in the shadow of their wooden doors where laughter and coarse songs spilled out along with the stink of sour wine. Inside, drunkards might call them in, sometimes tossing a coin onto the sticky table before even asking their name. Others prowled near the city's great bathhouses, where men, fresh from steam and oil, emerged flushed and bold. The women offered their company at a price, though the transaction often meant more risk than reward. For the city's streets were dangerous. Prostitute working without the protection of a brothel keeper or a powerful patron faced not just cruel clients but also harassment from gangs of idle youths. From thieves who knew she carried her meager earnings in a tied cloth pouch, from guards who could arrest her at whim for disturbing public order. Violence was common, a hand striking too hard, a night gone wrong in a dark alley. Some women returned home limping or bruised, others not at all. And yet there they were, night after night, standing beneath the flickering light of oil lamps, their bodies, both their livelihood and their greatest vulnerability. The city itself seemed to shift as dusk deepened. Markets closed, shutters slammed over stalls, but the underbelly of Rome only grew louder. Musicians played in taverns, dice clattered on tabletops, the slosh of amphorae being drained filled the air. Prostitutes moved among it all, weaving like shadows, whispering to potential clients, sometimes lowering their eyes in false modesty, sometimes calling boldly in coarse Latin phrases meant to provoke a laugh. They knew how to measure their voices, how to seem playful without seeming desperate. Survival was performance. One of our women, let us return to her now, lingered by a fountain near the Esquiline, where water trickled endlessly from a carved lion's mouth. She splashed her face, straightened her tunic, and waited. Men passed by, a weary soldier still smelling of the camp, a freedman with a heavy purse, a slave hurrying with an empty basket. Some ignored her, some leered. One slowed and tossed a coin at her feet, as though she were less than human. She picked it up anyway. Hunger did not allow pride, yet despite the dangers there was also community. Streetwalkers often banded together in pairs or small groups, keeping an eye on each other, warning of a violent man, sharing bread or wine when earnings were slim. Their laughter, thin but real, sometimes rang out across the alleys, small flame of humanity in a city that rarely gave them kindness. As the night wore on, the glow of torches lit the narrow lanes, and the women blended into Rome's restless nocturnal rhythm. Beneath the looming shadows of temples and arches, past shrines where flickering lamps burned for the gods, they worked. Half hidden, half revealed. Part of the eternal machinery of survival in the world's greatest city. For them, there was no feast awaiting, no silken bedchamber, no statues raised in marble. There was only the street, the endless negotiation between dignity and despair, the knowledge that when morning came, it would rise again and return to the same alleys, the same taverns, the same routines. The city swallowed them, used them, forgot them. And yet they endured, because enduring was all they could do. The sun dipped lower over the tiled rooftops of Rome, the shadows of the Subura stretching across the uneven paving stones. The day was not yet finished, but already the weight of it pressed on our women. For them, the work was never truly confined to a room or an alley. It lived with them in every glance, every whisper, every law that marked them as different. In Rome, a prostitute was more than a woman selling her body. She was branded, not with iron, but with infamia, dishonor, a stain that clung to her no matter how she bathed, painted her lips, or prayed to the gods. For Lucia, whose day had begun in the noisy Insula, she felt the mark of infamia in the way shopkeepers turned their eyes away when she passed. A baker who once sold her stale bread now kept his hand on the counter, waiting for her coin to drop before he pushed the loaf toward her, avoiding even the brush of her fingers. To respectable Romans, a prostitute was not merely poor or immoral. She was legally beneath them. Infamia stripped her of rights others took for granted. She could not stand in court as a witness, her voice silenced in the eyes of law. If she were beaten by a client or cheated of payment, what protection did she have? No, none. She belonged to a class outside the shield of Roman justice. And yet within the Subura, there was another kind of law, unwritten but deeply felt. Among the women themselves, there grew a fragile web of solidarity. Julia, who worked from a tavern room on the edge of the Vicus Tuscus, would often share her cosmetics with others, painting their cheeks with the same mixture of ochre and wine sediment, and the flicker of a single oil lamp. 3 or 4 women would sit together adjusting hairpins, laughing at some foolish story about a drunken soldier, and for a moment they were simply women again. Not outcasts, not infames. This was their survival, community in the margins. But outside, the divide could not be ignored. A passing matron, in a clean stola, her husband's household slaves trailing behind her, would lift her chin and glance away sharply as if the very sight of a prostitute might sully her. The irony was cruel. Many of those same husbands sought out the Subura by night, slipping coins into the hands of the women they publicly despised. The wives knew, the women knew, and yet society held its silence, letting the hypocrisy stand. The prostitutes, meanwhile, carried the double burden, used in secret, shamed in public. The harshness of infamia also played out in the smallest daily humiliations. When the women visited temples, as they often did, despite what respectable Romans assumed, they prayed quietly at the edges, never daring to step too close to the altars. A prostitute was thought unworthy of the gods' full attention, but desperation drove them there anyway. Before Venus, before Fortuna, before Mercury the trickster, they whispered the same prayers as any mother or daughter, for protection, for luck, for one more day of survival. Lucia often thought of her mother in those moments, a woman who had once worked a loom, who had tried to keep her daughter respectable, till the rent was too high and the dowry too small. Now, when Lucia walked the streets, men muttered insults, meretrix lupa, words that cut deeper than coins could heal. Her mother still lived, but the distance between them felt wider than the 7 hills of Rome. For a respectable woman to be seen with her daughter now would bring shame to the whole household. Such was the true cruelty of infamia. It severed ties, broke families, and left women floating untethered, clinging only to one another. By evening, the lamps of Rome were beginning to flicker to life. The great homes on the Palatine glowed softly, while in the Subura, candles guttered in smoky taverns. Soldiers staggered into the streets. Merchants loosened their belts after long days in the forum, and the demand for company grew again. For the women, there was no hiding. Their profession was branded upon them, not just by law, but by reputation. Still, they found ways to laugh. Julia teased Lucia about a client with crooked teeth, and Lucia retaliated with a joke about the brothel keeper's bald head shining like a goddess statue. Beneath the weight of infamia, they found scraps of joy, fragments of humanity. The world would not honor them, but they would honor each other. In whispered kindnesses, in shared wine, in moments stolen between one humiliation and the next. Tomorrow, their stigma would still remain. Tomorrow, they would still be infames. Tonight, at least for a moment, they were women in Rome, living, breathing, enduring. And so the city turned again, its streets echoing with laughter, curses, footsteps, and the unseen, unspoken burden of those who lived at its edges. Night came slowly to Rome, though in the Subura, it never truly grew quiet. As the sun dipped behind the Capitoline Hill, shadows stretched long across the cracked paving stones. The air, once stifling with the heat of day, cooled slightly, though it carried with it the sour stink of refuse, the pungent reek of fish bones rotting in gutters, and the sweet, heavy scent of spilled wine that had seeped into the dirt. It was in this shifting atmosphere that the district transformed. The day's honest bustle gave way to something darker, looser, more dangerous. The Subura at night was alive, with laughter, with violence, with desire. From the open doorways of taverns came the sound of dice rattling against wooden counters, followed by curses in Latin and Greek as men lost coin they could scarcely afford. Jugglers and cheap musicians entertained small crowds for a few coppers, their songs barely audible over the roar of drunken arguments. Torches stuck haphazardly into iron brackets on the walls, threw trembling halos of light across alleyways, creating a landscape of flickering gold and deep shadow. In that half-light, thieves lurked, waiting for someone too drunk to keep hold of their purse. For Livia and Marcia, our 2 women whose lives we have followed from morning, nightfall meant the busiest and most perilous hours of their day. Livia stood outside the brothel's entrance, leaning against the doorway where a painted fresco of Venus greeted customers with a coy smile. Her hair, stiff with cheap saffron dye, glowed oddly in the torchlight. She forced a smile as groups of men staggered past, some too far gone to notice her, others too eager, pawing at her arm as though she were already bought. Inside the lupanar, business was brisk. The keeper's wife shouted at girls to hurry, berating them if they tried to rest even for a moment. The line of men waiting grew longer as the night deepened. Marcia, meanwhile, had chosen the streets. She walked the edges of the taverns, where the smell of mulled wine and roasted meat made her stomach churn with hunger. She had eaten little that day, saving what coins she had earned to pay her rent in the insula. To stand idle was to risk going hungry tomorrow. So she lingered in the glow of a torch outside a gambling den, offering forced smiles to men staggering out with flushed faces and heavy purses. Some waved her off, preferring dice and drink to companionship. Others beckoned her into dark corners, their breath hot with wine, their hands rough and impatient. The danger of the streets came in many forms. There were patrols of vigils, the night watchmen, whose job it was to keep order, though often they harassed women like Marcia for bribes or favors. There were gangs of young men, sons of freedmen or petty criminals, who prowled the alleys in search of entertainment. They laughed as they harassed streetwalkers, tearing at their shawls or tossing them into the gutter. Marcia had learned to avoid their gears when she could, to duck into doorways or hide in shadows until they passed. Yet some nights, avoidance was not enough. Back inside the Lupaner, the atmosphere grew thick with heat and sound. The walls, already damp with the day's humidity, seemed to sweat alongside the bodies pressed within. The paintings of mythological lovers, Jupiter disguised as a swan, Pan-chasing nymphs, looked down mockingly on the transactions below. Coins clinked against the wooden counter as men paid their fee to the keeper. For a few denarii they bought not just the company of a woman, but a temporary escape from their own frustrations. The soldier from the frontier with scars across his face, the merchant cheated at the docks, the slave who had stolen a coin from his master. Livia, exhausted though she was, had no choice but to keep working, smiling when she wanted to cry, offering softness when all she felt was weariness. As midnight approached, the Subura became louder still. Somewhere nearby, a fight broke out, the crack of wood against flesh echoing down the alley. A torch toppled in the struggle, sending sparks into a pile of straw. And for a moment it seemed the whole tenement might go up in flames. Not an uncommon fate in this crowded district. Screams rose, then fell again, as men scattered into the dark. Life returned quickly to its usual rhythm, as though violence were simply another backdrop to the night. For women like Livia and Marcia, survival depended on keeping steady through it all, through the hunger, through the insults, through the endless parade of men whose faces blurred into one. They could never show too much fatigue, for a brothel keeper would replace them easily. And on the streets, weakness invited danger. Each torch, each drunken song, each rattle of dice was a reminder that in Rome's underbelly, the night belonged not to peace, but to chaos. Yet in rare moments, there were glimpses of humanity. A young soldier, barely more than a boy, wept softly after paying for an hour. Tling, Livia, of the comrades. He had lost on the German frontier. Marcia, approached by a tired stonemason with hands thick with calluses, found herself listening more than speaking. The man simply grateful for someone who would not laugh at his burdens. These fleeting fragments of tenderness lingered in their memories, reminders that behind the cruelty and transaction there still existed the smallest thread of shared humanity. As the night deepened, the women's bodies ached. Their voices grew hoarse, and their eyes stung with smoke from nearby torches. But the work did not stop. In Rome, the city that claimed never to sleep, the Subura was its restless heartbeat, pounding ceaselessly until dawn. And yet, even in the choking shadows of Rome's underbelly, moments of humanity still flickered like weak flames against the wind. As the night deepened in the Subura, after the rowdy laughter of drunken gamblers and the coarse songs of soldiers echoed down the alleyways, there were quieter corners where the women of the Lupaner and the streets gathered together. They were not bound by blood, nor by choice, but by necessity. And necessity in its cruel way formed bonds stronger than many families. In the cramped back room of the brothel, where the straw beds reeked of sweat and the plastered walls were cracked with damp, two women sat side by side. Their faces were painted in cheap rouge, their lips smeared with dyes that would fade by morning. One woman, Aurelia, hummed softly as she untangled her hair with her fingers. Her voice was fragile, like the whisper of a reed pipe in the distance, but it carried a tenderness that filled the room with warmth. Beside her, little Marcia, younger and less experienced, leaned her head against Aurelia's shoulder, closing her eyes for a moment of comfort. They had endured the same cruelty, the same endless parade of strangers, and yet in that shared misery, they found a kind of sisterhood, Sometimes they laughed together, truly laughed, not the hollow laughter they offered to clients, but the laughter of women who recognized one another's pain and mocked the absurdity of their situation. A half-drunk soldier stumbling naked through the wrong door, a wealthy merchant who passed out mid-sentence, the crooked teeth of a man who thought himself irresistible, these small absurdities became their relief, their medicine against despair. There were other moments, 2 moments of care. When one fell ill, too weak to rise from the straw, another would bring her water or press a damp cloth to her forehead. They had little enough for themselves, but they shared what they could. A piece of stale bread, a sip of wine, a borrowed shawl to fend off the winter chill. In a city that marked them as infames, as dishonorable, they honored each other with the only thing left to them, kindness. And always there were the dreams. Whispers carried in the stillness of the night about escape, about something more. Another spoke of a man, a freedman, who had promised marriage once he could afford it, though the others, with weary eyes, reminded her not to trust to Italy. And yet they dreamed, stubbornly, against the weight of Rome itself. Dreams of buying freedom, of leaving the Lupana, washing away the painted faces and standing in the daylight without shame. Of course, these dreams were fragile. Most would never come true. Coins were stolen, promises broken, hope dashed again and again. But still, they returned to the whispers, for to dream Evan in the darkest alleys of the Subura was to remain human. And so, amid the torchlight and the drunken chaos outside, the women of Rome's underworld carried on. They were scorned, they were mocked, they were dismissed as less than human by the very men who sought them out in secret. But together, they found fragments of something more: laughter, tenderness, defiance. These were their treasures, hidden away in the cracks of a world that sought only to use and discard them. As Aurelia tucked a strand of hair behind Marcia's ear, whispering, "Sleep now, just for a moment." Before the next knock on the door, the hum of life in the Subura carried on. But here in this fragile pocket of time, there was humanity. And that humanity, however fleeting, was their quiet rebellion. While the women of the Subura fought for every coin in darkened rooms and noisy taverns, another kind of prostitute existed in Rome, one far removed from the stench of the lupanar. These were the meretrices honestae, the courtesans who moved among senators, poets, and generals. They were not seen stumbling barefoot along the cobbles of the Subura, but stepping lightly across polished marble floors in villas that glowed with lamplight. They wore silk imported from the East, their hair dressed high and gleaming with oils, their wrists heavy with bangles of gold or glass, depending on the generosity of their patrons. In these lofty halls, the air smelled not of sweat and stale wine, but of myrrh and rosewater. The walls shimmered with frescoes, and the tables groaned with platters of figs, olives, roasted meats, and honey-soaked pastries. Here, a courtesan's work was not to endure the grunts of a drunken soldier or the fumbling of a tired dock worker, but to dazzle men of power with wit, song, and charm. They were expected to recite poetry, to know the latest gossip from the Senate, to pour wine gracefully into fine cups, and to smile as if they were not calculating every word, every gesture, to secure the favor of the men who controlled their lives. Yet even here, behind the silks and perfumes, there was no true freedom. A courtesan might share the couch of a senator one evening and dine at his banquet the next, but she was never invited into the circle of his family. His wife, cloistered and respectable, remained untouchable. While the courtesan was praised in public and scorned in private, both desired and despised. Her beauty, her cleverness, her very livelihood depended entirely on the whims of men. A single insult, a moment of lost charm, could mean the difference between wearing jewels and returning to the Subura with nothing. For the women below in the brothels, stories of these courtesans reached them like faint rumors, almost like tales of gods and heroes. In whispered conversations, some dreamed of rising to such a life, of being chosen, of escaping the stink of the lupanar for the sweet perfume of villas. But others, wiser or more bitter, laughed at the thought. Even a courtesan, they would mutter, is still a slave to a man's desire. Silk does not change chains. And in this contrast, between the women who walked in filth and those who reclined in luxury, the full weight of Rome's hypocrisy is laid bare. For in both worlds, whether in the flicker of torches in the Subura or the glow of lamps in a senator's hall, the women bore the same brand, infamia. Dishonor carved into their lives like an invisible mark. At last, the night begins to soften. The torches that flickered in the narrow alleys sputter out one by one, their flames dwindling as the oil burns away. The roar of laughter and drunken shouting in the taverns fades into scattered murmurs. The dice players finally stumbling home, clutching what few coins remain in their pockets. Rome itself exhales, settling under a blanket of darkness and silence. Inside the Subura, the women gather their things. In the brothels, the last clients have gone, some satisfied, some bitter, most already forgotten. The air still lingers with the scent of sweat, incense, and cheap wine, but the rooms are empty now. A bucket of water is poured across the stone floor to wash away the grime, though the stains never truly vanish. The painted walls, worn and fading, seem almost to sag with exhaustion, as if the very building has grown weary of its endless cycle. The women return to their tiny chambers, climbing stairways that creak and threaten to give way. The insulae, the great rickety apartment blocks of Rome, loom in the darkness, stacked high with families, beggars, laborers, and the forgotten poor. Behind one crooked door, a woman sits at a crude wooden table, spilling her handful of coins into the light of a single oil lamp. She counts them slowly. 1 coin for food tomorrow, 1 for rent, 1 hidden away beneath a broken tile on the floor. It is not much, never enough, but it is survival. Some sit in silence, nursing bruises left by unkind hands, washing their faces with cold water from a chip jug. Others lie flat on their straw mattresses, staring up at the cracked plaster, ceiling listening to the muffled noises of the city that never truly sleeps. A baby crying, a cart rattling, a man shouting in his drunken dreams. Exhaustion presses down on them like a heavy cloak. Yet even here, in these shadowed rooms, there is resilience. One woman whispers a quiet prayer to Venus, asking not for riches or beauty, but simply for another day. Another smooths the hair of her younger companion, who has wept herself into silence, and tells her softly that things will be better tomorrow, though both know it is only a fragile hope. And somewhere, tucked away in the folds of a blanket, a small pouch of coins grows slowly heavier, a secret hoard that might one day buy freedom, or at least a chance to begin again. As the city grows still, the contrast is sharp. In the villas on the Palatine Hill, the elites sleep on soft couches, their halls perfumed, their gardens quiet under the stars. In the Subura, however, dreams come fitfully, broken by fear and hunger. And yet, in their own way, the women of the streets are as much a part of Rome's heartbeat as senators, generals, or emperors. They are the unseen pulse beneath the marble and gold, the voices that history rarely remembers, but which once filled the alleys, the taverns, and the hidden corners of the eternal city. And so, as night settles fully over Rome, we leave them there, in their world of shadows and survival, of whispered laughter and unspoken grief, of fleeting tenderness and relentless hardship. Their story is not one of triumph, nor of glory, but of endurance. The quiet, stubborn persistence of those who lived on the margins and whose lives formed the texture of the ancient city. And so, as Rome itself falls into silence, we leave them in their world of shadows. Their stories remind us that history is not only marble statues and emperors, but also the forgotten and unseen. Good night,